me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our history as well as diversity, kinship and cultures, and really try to speak about this in relation to contemporary times. So as you're all familiar, there have been numerous policy approaches to Indigenous Australians from the beginning of invasion up until the present. And broadly, these have fit into ideas of elimination or genocide, so that frontier violence period, segregation followed by assimilation, so still that desire to eradicate Indigenous Australians from the broader population. And then from the 1970s until the present day era, we've really moved into a self-determination phase. But I would say probably more recently, we've definitely, come into this, neoliberal era, which is impacting child and family welfare, not child and family welfare, the welfare sector in general, as well as Indigenous Australians. Across a lot of service sectors, and I'm particularly because I'm most familiar with child and family welfare, we know that there's a lot of diverse state and territory policies and legislation and approaches, and that diversity can make it difficult for welfare workers to, I suppose, coordinate with different jurisdictions. So people working from Victoria then to working with people in Queensland or Western Australia, for example. So the case study I've chosen today is to actually have a look at a family whose traditional home is not from Melbourne but have migrated to Melbourne, because that's quite a common experience for Melbourne and Sydney, those big cities who are hubs of migration and movement for Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians. But importantly, I want you to think about the ways in which policy and practice for Indigenous Australians is always contested and complex and highly politicised. And this is something that still plays out day to day, and it's important for social workers and welfare workers to not just think about the interpersonal level and think about the people that they're working with, but also to think about the macro and the political sphere and the way in which that impacts on the day-to-day lives of the people that you work with. And I suppose one of the ways in which I see that come about quite often is the impact of Indigenous Australians being othered and situated as marginalised and exoticised within their own nation. So, as Indigenous peoples, we share experiences of colonisation with colonised peoples throughout the world. And, some of the history and some of the present day experiences are really not unique to Australia. If you look across the globe at First Nations people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to Turtle Island, North America, even the Sami people in the Arctic, a lot of the effects of colonisation are still felt by those First Nations people. So there's something in common that we all share, where colonisation is actually responsible. It's colonisation and the continued colonisation that still impacts Indigenous peoples today. And I suppose one of the ways in which that really plays out is how identity can't be separated from that history, and how we still see identity conflict and identity being constructed and I suppose politicised for Indigenous Australians. So if we think about the concept of Indigenous identity, it has always been something that has been defined for us and imposed on us, because we're a people who had our unique cultures and identities and nations that we didn't define as Indigenous nor Aboriginal. That is a Western concept that has been imposed on us. And the way in which our identity has been defined has changed, throughout the period of the last 200 years to even today. And I think it's really important to bring it up, because a lot of the families and a lot of the youth that you might be working with will be people that have probably had family histories of intergenerational trauma and disconnection from their cultures. where their families, their family knowledge and kinship structures might have been impacted, and information may have been lost, where they might be trying to find their identity or find their language or find their kinship or even find their mob. So it's important not to bring in any assumptions, and to understand that not all Indigenous people have the fortune of knowing where their family comes from. That's something really pertinent for young people who are grappling with identity formation, because we know that young people, you know, sort of between the ages of 15 to sort of 20 are really experiencing identity conflict, and if they're, you know, struggling with knowing about their Indigenous identity, and are struggling with that cultural connection, it can be a very vulnerable time for them, particularly being part of a minority population who, I suppose, whose cultures are not prominent in Australia. You know, they're far more likely to experience Western culture than they are Indigenous culture if they are not from a very strong, you know, family who has their cultural roots still intact. So, yeah, the idea of the other and the way in which Aboriginal people are othered, it's really important to thinking about Aboriginal identity, and to think about the ways in which Aboriginal history and identity have been forged by that pre-invasion history, but also that post-invasion contact, and to think about the ways in which, as Martin Nakader, as a Torres Strait Islander theorist, he speaks about this concept of being at the cultural interface, which is the intersection of the Indigenous world with, you know, the Western world that we all live within. And for a lot of Indigenous people, it's that space in between the both, where we kind of have to traverse and go in and out of in our day-to-day life. So for me, for example, it might be a case of I'm in the Indigenous world when I'm around my Indigenous family, but then I'm traversing this non-Indigenous space when I go to my place of employment at the University of Melbourne, which is, you know, a Western institution, which has a lot of traditional Western structures and approaches. And it's about actually traversing those spaces, keeping your cultural values intact, and trying to negotiate that space. And that's something, that concept I think is really pertinent for a lot of Aboriginal people that live in urban areas, but also a lot of Aboriginal people that live in places where Aboriginal people are not the dominant population, which is, you know, a lot of the east coast of Australia. I did want to have a bit of a talk about pre-colonisation history. Now, I apologise for those of you who are already familiar, but when we're thinking about pre-colonisation, it was around 1 million Indigenous Australians who were here prior to British contact. And interestingly, it's forecast that the Indigenous population in Australia will reach 1 million again, probably by about the year 2030. So we're actually going back to the population that we had pre-colonisation. And, you know, importantly, contrary to what early anthropologists thought, our cultural systems are highly sophisticated. And we managed to, you know, go through some incredible environmental change and still survive that over at least 40 millennia. So from an Indigenous worldview, it's not just 60,000 years, but actually there's a widely held belief that we've been here since time immemorial, and that our peoples have always been here. And I think, you know, the fact that we are still surviving shows the strength of our cultures in adaptation and change. And for that reason, I think it's particularly important to think about the ways in which Indigenous cultures and peoples have evolved as peoples who still maintain some of those elements of pre-colonisation culture, but have also adapted to living in a Western world. And I think about early anthropological discourse, which really sat within three main themes of Indigenous peoples of having a primitive or a savage kind of culture, or a romanticised kind of depiction of our cultures where we would be looked upon and gazed upon as exotic, as people who are different, still often with an inferior lens, but, you know, there was some awe at the ways in which, you know, our creation stories might be told, or our use of boomerangs or utikis might be gazed upon with, you know, admiration. And the other discourse in early anthropology was really around racist depictions of Indigenous Australians. And again, it really fit within that social Darwinian notion of evolution of the fittest and of whiteness being akin to the most evolved peoples. And Indigenous Australians actually were constructed as being a barbaric population whose cultures were essentially seen as the missing link between apes and humans. We were seen as the lowest on the rung of unevolved cultures, and we're certainly, when we look at British colonisation throughout the globe, Indigenous Australians were ranked lower than a lot of the other nations that were invaded. So Maori people's cultures were placed above Indigenous Australians. We were considered really quite savage, and that led to a lot of horrible practices in anthropology, where there was an obsession with stealing skulls from grave sites and shipping them off throughout the Americas to have them studied, to having skulls measured to try to ascertain how close our skulls were to that of apes. And, you know, this sort of practice is not something that just lived in the past. In the 1970s in Canberra, there was an exhibition where 3 skulls were placed, one of a male ape, the other of an Indigenous Australian, and the third of a white person. And the label on it read something to the effect of the evolution of human sophistication. And, you know, it was a clear indication of Indigenous Australians being compared as that missing link to apes. And that's only 50 years ago. So I think it's really important to think about the ways in which these anthropological discourses around who we are and what our cultures entail still tend to influence our understanding of Indigenous cultures today. And I see a lot of it take place in this kind of romanticised notion of Indigenous cultures. If we look at the ways in which Indigenous cultures are often displayed now in non-Indigenous Australia, we see, you know, attraction to showcasing Indigenous art, to showcasing Indigenous music and language. And we see sort of, you know, even recently throughout the AFL Sir Douglas Nicholls round, you know, we have the jumpers that are absolutely beautiful, but they're showcasing one aspect of our cultures. And I think it's really important to understand that there are aspects of Indigenous cultures that have links to the pre-colonisation past, but there are also aspects of our cultures that have a lot more in common with all humans and with people from various backgrounds, from Irish to English to Russian and Italian. And that really is the importance of our kinship, of our families, and how our family values impact who we are. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the lecture. But I wanted to move on to have a bit of a conversation about that early period of colonisation that was around invasion, protection and segregation. I do imagine that a lot of you are familiar with this content, but as you all know, European settlement began in 1788. And it began when the land was declared as terra nullius, which is a Latin expression meaning no man's land. I think the concept of terra nullius is still really pertinent today because essentially it enabled the illegal occupation and possession of Australia for the British people who arrived. And even though we have had the Mabo decision, which has you know, challenged terra nullius, I'm not sure legally if it has actually overturned terra nullius, but it has provided evidence that the claims to terra nullius were false. there's still this sense that non-Indigenous sovereignty has still been maintained despite this illegal possession of Australia through the Declaration of Terra Nullius, which has been found, you know, in a court of law to have been illegitimate. But these illegitimate claims to sovereignty play out against the background of Indigenous peoples asserting their sovereignty to this land. And I think that's why we still have such tension in race relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia today, because we have this concept of non-Indigenous Australians, you know, feeling belonging to this country, to Australia, you know, because they have lived here for multiple generations. And Indigenous Australians saying, well, we never ceded our sovereignty, we never willingly gave up the land, it was stolen from us. And it's something that I think non-Indigenous Australia still has to contend with and still has to understand that there is still a need to accept that we live on stolen, unceded land. And only through accepting our past can we actually reconcile with the present, and why race relations can still be such a site of political debate, and can still be, you know, a site of deep soreness for Indigenous peoples. Now, as I spoke about before, those notions of Indigenous cultures being inferior really enabled that initial frontier violence, which lasted for well over the first 100 years. And I know a lot of you are familiar, but I think I find it really interesting to look at the massacres that actually took place throughout Indigenous Australia. And I have an animation that hopefully will work. I might have to stop my screen share for now though.
Yeah, it's okay. We are familiar with this.
Yeah. Okay. Now everyone should be able to see a map of Australia, is that right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so this map, this is a project that's been undertaken by the University of Newcastle, and it's the frontier massacres that took place from the period of 1780 up until 1930. So I'm going to play it for you. It begins at the period from 1780 and it'll continue up until 1930. It just goes for a couple of minutes. So what you'll see is a bunch of dots that start to pop up, and they're the sites of the massacres that have taken place. So we're at the period of 1810 now. Moving into 1820, and you can see there are sort of dots popping up in Sydney, New South Wales, Tasmania starting to be covered. All along the east coast, Victoria, up to Brisbane. Starting to see some sites pop up over in the west coast along near Perth. You get the picture, we're up into the 1890s now. Moving to 1910, sort of around the beginning of the stolen generations. Now finished at 1930. So I think it's a really telling map at the ways in which that violence spread, really up until the the early 20th century, and you know how these were really concerted attempts to eradicate the Indigenous population. This was genocide that was taking place. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing that slide, and I'll go back to slides. Okay, can everyone see my slides again? Yep, beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. So by the sort of around the 1890s, survivors of those massacres were rounded up and started to be placed on missions and reserves for their own protection. And it was really thought that the government's role was to smooth the pillow of a dying race, that Indigenous Australians were a doomed population that were going to become extinct anyway, and that, you know, if governments would just round Indigenous peoples up and leave them in to their own devices, eventually, you know, the Indigenous problem would be solved. But as we all know, it didn't happen that way due to what was termed a rising number of half-caste children, who many were the product of rape, and, you know, were the product of, you know, our Indigenous women being raped by non-Indigenous men. Of course, there were some consensual relationships, but we do need to keep in mind the way in which violence was enacted on Indigenous women's bodies as well. But the idea behind the stolen generations was really that you could take away an Indigenous child from their family and from their cultures, from their land and community, and that eventually they would be absorbed into the white population and would no longer be Indigenous, but would become essentially white, culturally white, but also genetically white. It was really thought that our genetics were inferior and wouldn't last. And these were notions that were picked up off of social Darwinism, that also enabled some of the horrors that we saw in Nazi Germany, that same kind of that same kind of understanding of eugenics. And, you know, it was widely studied and it was a scientific accepted proof. You know, there are some buildings at the University of Melbourne that are named after these very prolific eugenicists that published widely and held a lot of esteem, that were really respected for sort of upholding eugenics. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the stolen generations. It's probably an aspect of Indigenous history in Australia that's told most. And I think that's because it's been given a national narrative and a history through the publication of the Bringing Them Home report. So the Bringing Them Home report labels that period between the 1910s and the 1970s as the period of the stolen generations, where it's estimated that somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were removed from their families and moved off into missions or into institutions. And again, if you look at the definition of genocide, which is, it's held in one of the international covenants, the name's just slipped my mind, but one of the definitions of genocide is the removal of Indigenous children from a particular cultural group in order to sort of enable miscegenation and control population breeding, and also to sort of stop those those children from growing up within their cultures. And the Bringing Them Home report does say in one of its final conclusions that they found that the stolen generations and the policies that accompanied with it were tantamount to genocide and could be placed definitely under the classification of genocide. Of course, when the report was handed down and John Howard got in power, that finding of genocide was fiercely contested and refuted. And around that period, we saw a lot in Australia about the history wars and people contesting the findings of the Royal Commission, who did find that genocide had happened. Yeah, so like I said, that intent was for Indigenous kids to lose their Aboriginality and essentially become white. I think it's really important to acknowledge, and I certainly see this in contemporary child and family welfare practice, that history, you know, from invasion right through to the 1970s, where we switched from, you know, that period of assimilation to self-determination, it does continue to impact on the present. And I like to draw on a non-Indigenous theorist called Patrick Wolfe here, who actually spoke about the ways in which colonisation is not is not an event in settler colonial countries like Australia, where the desire for the settler population was to remain and to stay in that country, not to use the native peoples for slave labour or you know, to mine the natural resources of the country, but where the intent was for a new population to come and live on that land. That colonisation is actually evident in various institutions and structures that continue to this day that do not always accord well with Indigenous peoples. And welfare institutions are one of those structures that still have colonial values embedded in them. As are education systems and government systems, these are structures that still have a particular political slant that is still somewhat premised on, you know, the desire for a future white Australia. And we have to acknowledge that, given the intent at Federation for Australia to create a white future premised on that white Australia policy. So in these ways, that intergenerational trauma is still having an ongoing impact on Indigenous peoples. And this idea of colonisation actually being a structure and not an event can help us to understand how systemic racism is actually embedded into institutions, and then how that continues to impact on Indigenous peoples in ways that can be invisible to people who are working within those institutions when they aren't actually interrogating them through a critical race lens. And I'm thinking here about an Indigenous scholar, Debbie Bargile, who had a book come out, I think it was last year or perhaps the year before, but she looked at racism within government institutions, and she's someone who is an Australian, an employee of the Australian Public Service, and she interrogated through a critical race lens the ways in which that institutional racism is still very much embedded in government systems. So if you're interested in looking at her work, it's available through the IACCESS website. But I think it's something, you know, when we think about how institutional racism plays out, it's often not something that's deliberate, but it's so deeply entrenched and embedded into those systems that kind of take on a life of their own. You know, and this goes for welfare institutions, and it goes back to welfare's original intentions in Australia, and that was to hand out welfare to those deserving of welfare. You know, and I'm thinking about the charitable sisters and the ways in which we actually constructed people as non-deserving recipients of welfare. And even more recently, when we look at politician Joe Hockey, when he was talking about the age of entitlement, we still have this discourse in Australia around who is deserving of assistance and who really needs to go out and look after themselves. Even Tony Abbott, you know, in 2015, when he was talking about remote communities and the unwillingness of Australia to fund, quote, lifestyle choices, you know, this discourse of who deserves welfare, it still plays out in your day-to-day work, and you can see that with the limitations that are placed on services that you're able to provide and how long for. You know, that all comes from this very political and politicised position. But this ongoing invasion into Indigenous families and family lives has resulted in, like what I was saying before, that fracturing of our kinship systems. You know, and a lot of the people that come into contact with welfare services come from families who have an intergenerational story of removal. You know, families who are descendants of the stolen generations and have been the direct target of that intensive interference and invasion in their lives in an attempt to assimilate them. So understanding that, you know, the young people that you're working with, you know, might come from these family backgrounds, these cultural backgrounds where that information is not known to them. And it's important to think about, you know, the diversity of Indigenous Australia. You know, as one of the oldest surviving cultures in the world, that's 65,000 plus years as determined by scientific knowledge. For Indigenous knowledges, it's time immemorial. But, you know, thinking about First Nations people who comprised, 200 plus different groups with such diverse languages and histories of colonization, which all impact, those individual identities and those subjectivities. And, while we have this, beautiful cultural knowledge and values that speak to the way in which country cares for the people and we care for country in return, and we have, a lot of Dreamtime stories around country, it's often, those people who have been forcibly removed from their country throughout stolen generations. Not the stolen generations, sorry, the stolen generations and before that, through the frontier violence and the segregation and the assimilation. All of that impacts on people's ability to still be connected to their country. Even in a place like Melbourne, where so much country is now urban population that belongs to many, many different people, and can't be used in the ways that, the Wurundjeri people may like to use this land. But, for Indigenous peoples, that country still indicates place and belonging. And that's very much intertwined with kinship and families. And I wanted to give you this beautiful example by Auntie Mary Graham, who wrote about identity and connectedness to kinship and country, and I want to read it out. Although Indigenous people everywhere are westernised to different degrees, Aboriginal people's identity is essentially always embedded in land and defined by their relationships to it and to other people. The sacred web of connections includes not only kinship relations and relations to the land, but also relations to nature and all living things. And Auntie Mary Graham, she's, theorised this concept of what she calls relationality. So the ways in which relationships essentially guide Indigenous peoples and teach us who we are in the world, who we belong to, and teach us how to connect with each other. And for young people, they teach us this value of relationality, connection to kinship, to land, to country, to our ancestors. They teach us our belonging, and they teach us how to be in the world, and it guides our actions. It guides who we are. It helps with that identity formation. It helps with that belonging, and it helps with those connections with each other. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this map. This is Norman Tinsdale's map, but I like to show it because it really does evidence just how many different nation groups and cultures we are referring to when we talk about Indigenous Australia. That idea of being Indigenous or Aboriginal as that imposed identity construct, which is why more recently the term First Nations is coming much more into vogue among, First Nations people, to actually showcase that diversity and the ways in which we all have our own identity and our own belonging. For me, that's Noongar from the deep south. I'm a Minang woman from Albany, Mount Barker. Even though I lived in Melbourne my whole life, my land and my identity comes from that Minang country. And some of the strengths of our culture is that, even for those people who are not living on their country or have had their connections to country severed in some way as a result of colonisation, country still has, it still signifies place for us and belonging. And we still do have spiritual connections with country. And for some Indigenous peoples, that may not be the country that they belong to. It may not be their country of origin, particularly if they come from a background where they don't know where their country is or they don't know who their mob is. But a lot of us feel connection to country and absolutely love being in nature and those natural environments, because we're a people whose cultures are so intertwined with country and family. Our cultures, and this is, a value that we share with many different cultures. We absolutely, we are a collective peoples whose kinship structures and our family ties really indicate, again, that place and that belonging. They help us find our identity, and they help us sort of understand who we belong to. And it's really interesting, I see for a lot of young people in out-of-home care who might not be living with their family, the love that their extended family has for them, even though they may have had very little to do with them, it's just, it's always there, it's ever present. And I mean, I know with my extended family who live in Western Australia, that I can call people up that I might not have spoken to in years. And if I'm in trouble and I need help, somebody is going to come to my aid. So I think for you all working with youth, you know, a lot of you in the homelessness sector, but for others maybe in different welfare services, thinking about how even though people might feel disconnected from their family or might not have those active connections, that you can try to reach out to those family members and connect to them. And when they do have those strong family roots, often there is a family member that is willing to step up. And for some Indigenous peoples whose families and their connections, their kinship structures may have been fractured as a result of colonisation, thinking about the concept, a very broad notion of family, and the ways in which Indigenous peoples, particularly young peoples, can kind of construct their own Indigenous families. And I found that so much in my PhD research, where I spoke to young people with an experience of out-of-home care who had been placed in permanent care away from their Indigenous family. And they spoke about how, you know, they had met Indigenous people along their journey and had kind of essentially claimed them as family and had built up their own little group of family. That wasn't biological, but it was a family that they had created for themselves. And I think young people are very resilient in being able to do that. So even if they don't have that biological family, Indigenous peoples do really take on this very broad notion of family that doesn't have to involve biological relations. It can be Indigenous people that have accepted them as family without that biological connection. And I think that's where community really comes into it as well. That community can be a way of finding or creating a family that you may not naturally belong to, but that you can become a part of, and how community can become a site of belonging. And in a place like Melbourne and even Victoria, as such a big city, which is a hub of migration, there are a lot of Indigenous people from various First Nations communities that all come here, that don't necessarily have people from their mob living here, but create their own communities and families with other people from other mobs. You know, in a place like Melbourne, I see that, you know, so often, you know, with young people who go to university and sort of, you know, find other Indigenous people from the, you know, various nations. And I even see it a lot, you know, on social media now, and the connections that Indigenous peoples form with each other through social media. So thinking innovatively about how you can kind of tap into so that some of those strengths of Indigenous culture and how you can try to tap into that virtual community that's alive today. So as I was saying before, you know, we have quite a complex system of family relations, and like ideally everyone knows their kinship in the land, but that's not always the case. That broad notion of extended family, it's really at the core of Indigenous kinship structures. And, you know, it defines where a person fits into that community, and it defines how culture is passed on and how society is organised. But, you know, these systems vary across communities, across First Nations lands, but they have those similar functions, and that's around, you know, defining roles and responsibilities, you know, sharing and obligations around child rearing and education. And elders play such a critical role here. You know, elders, I put on the slide, they bridge the past with the present and provide that guidance for young people. And elders are still so very much revered and respected today. And there is a deep respect for elders, even if they're not elders from your lands, but elders of different nations. This is something I developed in a few years ago in an early paper I wrote, but it was to try to situate Indigenous children within that ecological model originally developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. So I placed the child at the centre, and I've put a much broader notion of family around the child. But before I've gotten to the family, I've actually put in culture as kind of like a lens. If you think about it like if you put on a contact lens and you put it in your eye, it's this notion that you see the world through your culture, and that influences your interactions with the world around you, including those interpersonal relationships, but also those interactions at that kind of macro level, through to the political environment and your interactions with society. And I personally think that's a really relevant model for everyone. We all see the world through our own lens of culture, which is why it's so important to kind of interrogate our own ethnocentrism and what values we bring to our practice as social workers and welfare workers. But going back to this notion of a broad understanding of family, I wanted to give a bit of an example about skin groups and kinship groups. And keep in mind that not all First Nations people have skin groups anymore or know who their skin groups are. This is knowledge that has been fractured for a lot of First Nations peoples, including my own. I don't have a skin group. But this notion of the skin group still plays out for people like myself who don't know what my skin group is. And it's this idea that all people with the same skin grouping as my mother are my mothers. They have the right, the same as my mother, to watch over me, to control what I'm doing, to make sure that I do the right thing. It's an extended family thing, and it's a wonderful, secure system. And that idea that, your mother's sisters are your mothers, to different degrees, that's relevant for a lot of First Nations peoples, and for some it might not be. There is that diversity among us, but again, it's this idea that we have, a very broad notion of family, and have these ways of understanding our roles within our families that extend beyond that nuclear Western model. That it's not just, the parents and the children, but actually we're taking on board a much larger idea of family, again, which may or may not be biological, and for some it may not even be people from their mob group. It may be that constructed family that they've made for themselves. So for a lot of people in urban communities, while we may not have skin groups anymore, we often know who we're related to extensively by surname. And again, I want to point out that this is not for everyone, because we have to keep in mind those people whose family and kinship structures have been, really fractured and impacted by colonisation. But for me, I can rattle off a handful of different surnames that I'm related to, and I'll know when I go back to WA that, people who have that surname are likely to be related to me. So, that sort of enables us to sort of know who's part of our family in a very broad sense. And some of those surnames may, be relevant from sort of 7 generations back, but there's still that connection. And thinking about the ways in which, community refers broadly to geographical areas. So this notion, this Pan-Aboriginal notion of Indigenous peoples coming together as a broad group, it initially began as kind of like a political movement to get Indigenous people supporting each other in the self-determination efforts, but we still have ways of, knowing who we're more connected to through uses of the word Koori, for example, which refer generally to First Nations people from Victoria and into New South Wales as well. Or we might be thinking about the Koori community as it relates here to Melbourne or Wurundjeri land. So there are different ways that we think about community as well. And those community events such as NAIDOC Week can be fabulous sources of strength and survival and celebration, but they can also be areas of shared grief. And they can also be really nice, accessible sites for non-Indigenous Australians to kind of see Indigenous communities in urban areas as visible. I want to move into a bit of a conversation about welfare work with Indigenous Australians and to think about, that historically tumultuous relationship, which really began around the time of the stolen generations, when social workers and welfare workers were very much involved in removing Indigenous children from their mums and would be the ones there taking Indigenous children away from their mums in hospitals without the mum's consent or even with the mum's knowledge. And that distrust of welfare still comes about today. And I think that distrust, given welfare workers' involvement with police as well, and that the work where, in family violence, for example, you work quite closely with police services. There's that distrust that Indigenous people have of the police and of the state as well that impacts how you view welfare workers, perhaps not as people who are just there to try to help you, but as people who might be there to actually surveil you and be responsible for having more interference into your life. And for a lot of Indigenous people, that can be negative with child removals and child protection. In some research that was conducted by Louise Harms and a few colleagues, probably about 10 years ago, that I was involved in, we looked at what Aboriginal people said that social workers needed to know. And it was that importance of, that history and the impact that that's had. That knowledge of family and community structures to make sure that welfare workers and social workers are actually challenging their ethnocentrism and those ideas of what constitutes family and community, and are actually really trying to draw on the strengths of our cultures, keeping in mind that our cultures have evolved, and trying to challenge these romanticised images of our cultures as existing only in a certain way. And also for welfare workers to be very cognizant of the impact of social work interventions, thinking about that role of surveillance and that role of the state interfering into Indigenous people's family lives. And for young people, it could be fear of youth justice or fear of, child protection involvement, or fear of somebody who exerts power over them, controlling their life in some way. And, it's really important that welfare workers take into consideration the fact that in order to do this work effectively, it involves acknowledging racial bias and systemic racism and the ways in which they play out within the systems that you work within. Now, that idea of systemic racism, it's implicit in that, like I was saying before, those welfare interventions, which are essentially moral judgments about who is deserving or undeserving of assistance. In child welfare work, I definitely see it around those moral judgments concerning what constitutes good parenting, which is often derived from a very middle-class white value basis. In our ethnocentrism, it really shapes how we see the world and how we interact with systems. So, it's really important to critically interrogate your positionality and your own ethnocentrism and what you bring into the work. Acknowledging intersectionality as well, that we all carry with us varying degrees of privilege and oppression, and those kind of shape how we interact with other people and systems. That we may carry privilege, in our racial identity, but our gender identity or our sexual identity or our you know, our ability or disability status, they all impact what degrees of privilege and oppression we carry with us. But from a racial point of view, thinking about how Australian systems and institutions are really built on that foundation of whiteness and that desire for a white Australian future. You know, these are the systems that we work within today that have a particular historical foundation that, you know, and we know institutions carry cultures of their own. And for the last part of my lecture, I wanted to move into a conversation about what I think is what I prefer as the best model for working with not only Indigenous peoples, but I think for all culturally and linguistically diverse peoples. This idea of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility, you know, and that this is a journey that often begins with unawareness and sometimes even destructiveness when it comes from this biased position where we don't actually know the impact that we're having. And thinking that it's about more than just being aware of culture, of different cultures and their diversity, but it's the ability to learn from and relate respectfully to the people that you're working with. Acknowledging that the people that you're working with who come from diverse cultures are experts in their own lives and in their own cultures. And it's your job to understand what their cultures mean to them and how they interrelate with the world. And understanding that actually, you know, the journey of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility is about lifelong learning. That idea of cultural competency is kind of that minimum standard for ensuring that you are not racist, but that cultural responsiveness is about actually understanding that even though you are a professional and you have, you know, a degree and qualifications and vast experience, when it comes to somebody else's culture that you do not share, you are actually the learner, and they are the expert. You are having to learn from them. And acknowledging that with humility and knowing that we're all on a journey and we're all constantly learning. You know, I'm always surprised at how much I still have to learn about Indigenous Australia, but I'm in no way do I ever feel like I'm an expert. I'm acknowledging that I'm constantly learning. And, you know, that's just someone who has been so immersed in such a wide body of literature, you know, particularly with my PhD over the last 4 years. So I think, you know, we can have a wealth of experience, but there's always something that we're going to be able to learn from somebody else. So it's about that repositioning of our clients as experts and having that respect for them. So, you know, thinking about cultural responsiveness, it's that ongoing reflective practice and that critical reflection and learning about your own ethnocentrism and challenging that, you know, that lifelong journey, which is, you know, work that is relationship focused, you know, it's person and community centered, and it's around appreciating that diversity between groups of people, that diversity within families and between families, within and between communities, you know, that diversity of Indigenous Australians and the ways in which colonisation has created perhaps even more diversity than what there originally was pre-colonisation. You know, and finally, you know, working towards cultural responsiveness, it requires you to have access to knowledge about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, peoples and cultures. And that's something that's, you know, very much come from Indigenous peoples themselves. We want you to come on this journey with us and join us in trying to create a better, you know, reconciled Australia, where we can accept the legacies of our history and accept our true history. You know, that truth telling, the process that we're going to be going through that started now in Victoria around our Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That truth telling is so important for us to move forward.